Hello, friends, and welcome to Page Chewing and welcome to the Friday conversation. And this week, David is my guest. David, will you start us off with an introduction, please?
Hi, I'm David Weill. Nice to meet you.
Yeah. So I'm excited to talk to you because I looked at your background and it's very interesting. I mean, of course, it's a very interesting background, but what can you tell us about your work and how it relates to your book that was just released on June 11th?
So I've been a transplant doctor my entire career. I mostly did lung and heart transplantation, and I spent the majority of my career at Stanford in California. I'm a New Orleans native, and so I moved back home several years ago after I left the hospital setting. But I spent most of my career in California in the heart and lung transplant arena, and that informs my writing. A lot of my writing is based on that.
Yeah, I would say, so your book is related to that field, right? So you drew your work experience or your life experience to develop the story and characters.
Yeah, I mean, the great thing about doing my kind of work is, I ran into a lot of people that did this kind of work that inform my characters. Rich characters, brilliant but flawed. A lot of the people I worked with, so I had a lot to draw upon.
So what made you decide to write a novel? I mean, what was the spark that ignited that desire?
Well, in 2021, I published a memoir about my life in the transplant arena and told patient stories and the emotional ups and downs of doing this kind of work. But I felt like because it was nonfiction and because I had the ability to, to really offend people if I went too far, I felt like I was a little constrained in what I could say or wanted to say. And I feel like with the novel, I was able to really explore some of the themes about healthcare and about interpersonal relationships that I couldn't really get fully into in my nonfiction work.
Wow. Were there any nerves when did you have any concerns about writing characters that were too close to people that you've known or people that you know or know
I,
now?
I didn't really because I really don't think any of the characters, including the main one, is any one specific person. I think there were more combinations of people that I met along the way doing this kind of work.
Hmm. When What was your experience like to go from being a transplant doctor to writing a book and going through that whole process? Because the publishing industry, I think for people who aren't familiar with the ins, kind of like how it works behind the scenes, what happens between writing the book and getting the book in your hands. What was that whole experience like for you?
It was really different. I mean, also the thing that impressed me most about it right away was how solitary it is because you spend a few years working on the book by yourself, and then you go out and start talking about it like we're doing now. Transplant was the ultimate team sport. We had 55 people on our team at Stanford, and there was always a lot of folks around. And I had to get used to a more solitary experience, which at times was difficult.
How did you get through those times when you felt like you felt a little lonely or like solitary? What did you do to get through those times?
I think a lot of it is just using the time to reflect and also to think about what I've written. But I also have been lucky because I'm still in the transplant arena. I spend about half the day writing, and the other half of the day I do transplant related consulting where I'm helping transplant programs that are struggling for a variety of reasons. So I'm more a coach these days than quarterback, to use the sports metaphor. Um, so I feel still connected to the field, which I think is great.
So you're the crafty veteran, huh?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I get reminded of that all the time. So yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's it must be such a stressful and I mean, could just because you have someone's life in your hand, I couldn't imagine what that's like on a daily basis.
Yeah, I read a lot about this in my first book, but in the novel that just came out, I also try to portray the responsibility that goes along with it. It's a massive responsibility. There's no getting around that. But it does become part of your job. All of us have work, and this was my work. I My work was a little bit different because I carried around a waiting list with a bunch of names on it that we needed to transplant, but at the same time, it was my job and it's what I always knew. But it certainly had its emotional ups and downs. I mean, we were so euphoric when things turned out well, and then devastated when things didn't turn out so well. And so you get used to that roller coaster. So does your family.
Oh yeah, I'm sure it's a lot for everyone around you, not just you. And I'm fascinated with how, as we get older in life and our life experiences, how are those experiences shape and craft us? What has changed about you on a fundamental level from when you started that kind of work, and how did you bring that into, or did you bring that into your characters in the book?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think when you're young, and when I started this, working in this field after I went through my training period, I was 30 years old, and things that look different, as a 30-year-old, and I'm 60 now, and things look different. Things happen to you. I had kids of my own, and so when I was taking care of somebody else's kids, I couldn't help but think about my own.
Mm.
And then my father got a transplant early on in my career, and that changed me because I became a family member of a transplant recipient, not just the doctor on the other side. And so, these life experiences change who we are. But the
Mhm.
good thing, I think, is that when it comes to writing, I don't think I could have written any of these books when I was 30 years old, because I don't think I really was evolved enough, frankly,
Mm.
to really write them. I think it takes a lot of contemplative self reflection to get these words down on a page, because I think the readers are looking for emotion.
Mhm.
And I think, well, I don't know. I hope that I was able to evoke that emotion on the page.
When you had the story in your mind, did you develop characters on the side, or did they come to you as you were crafting the story?
More of the latter. I'm not much of an outliner, and I kind of write my way out of problems. I certainly understood the main character pretty well, and he was a combination of some of the people I worked with. But I also think the other characters in the novel interest me a lot, and I
Hmm.
really thought about who those people were, and and how were they able to impact the main character so that he would change during the course of the novel, and of course he did.
Hmm. When you were developing the story, were there anything that you wanted to draw out of your experience to inform people like me who have no idea what happens behind the scenes in that field, to kind of what goes on in that world?
Yeah, I mean, I was hoping that the readers that don't work in this field, and that would be most of the readers,
Yeah.
would kind of understand what it feels like to do the job. Not so much like a Grey's Anatomy version of it, but more of a, what's on the mind of people that are trying to put new hearts and lungs in people, and how do they feel when it goes well? How do they feel when it goes poorly? How do they interact with their colleagues? And those are the kind of things that interest me a lot. And I wanted to make sure in really both of my books, but in the novel in particular, that I saw how the impact of, or I showed how the impact of doing this kind of work impacted the relationships around the central character, who had a romantic interest during, in the novel. And that relationship really was impacted heavily by the kind of work that the protagonist did.
Yeah, I would imagine it's hard to turn that off. It's not just a when you walk out those doors, it's your mind. I bet it goes everywhere with you.
Yeah, and that was true of my main character, and it was true of
Yeah,
me as well when I did the work.
yeah. When you were telling the story and developing and bringing your characters into it, were there what about characters is important to you? What traits did you bring into them, or what? I don't want to say tropes, but what kind of feeling did you want the reader to get from your characters?
I think the hardest thing for me as a first time novelist was to make them three dimensional,
Hmm.
to neither be all good or all bad, to be sort of cardboard or
Yeah.
stereotypical. I think that was the biggest challenge. But, hopefully I was able to show them, and there's seven or eight that I think are the most important in this book, but to show them in their full selves, and to also show them interacting with my main character in a way that I think was authentic, because I saw some of these kind of interactions, myself in the hospital setting.
And Just hearing about your work and experiences, how did you find time to write your not only this book but your previous book? How did you manage to do that with how busy you are?
Yeah, I did. I did most of the heavy lifting after I left the full time practice.
Hmm.
When I decided to take a career change, I was only 52 years old. I was relatively young,
Hmm.
for what we do, to change directions. But I really, one of the goals in changing directions was not only to become a consultant in the transplant arena, but also I really did want to write books. I had always been an avid reader and thought, like a lot of people that read a lot, maybe I should try my hand at it. And I really wanted to give it a whirl. But you're right. I mean, it's time consuming. I mean, it's amazingly time consuming, and it's time consuming in a good way, though.
Hmm.
I really enjoy that part of it quite a bit, and I'm looking forward to my third book that I'm working on right now.
Oh wow, you have a third one coming already.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. That's going to be a while. I'm in early days with it.
Oh, nice. It's a labor of love, really. Just to, I mean, I'm not a writer. I don't even want to try going there because I don't have it in me yet. But yeah, it's very time consuming. It's very consuming and solitary at the same time. So it's tough to squeeze it all in
Yeah.
with what you're doing. When when you said you're an avid reader, what is your favorite book?
It's interesting. I read a book by Walker Percy that I have behind me,
Hmm.
still there, called The Moviegoer. When I was a kid, I grew up in New Orleans, and so the book was set in New Orleans, and I loved it. And so I ended up reading all of his books. He was actually a physician as
Oh,
well, who became a novelist, and he never practiced. So he went through medical school and residency and all of that, and never practiced. Went straight to writing. And The Moviegoer was a favorite of mine, and it's one I've reread a few times.
wow. That's so he never practiced. He went through all that and never.
Yep, never practiced.
Wow. That's a career change after all that work and energy.
Yep.
Yeah, that's wild. Were you an avid reader as a child too?
Yeah, I inherited that from my mother. My mother's a big time reader. She reads 75 to 80 books a year, and she's 88 and years old and still reading away. And like a lot of kids, I looked at what my parents did, and she got me very interested in books and would pass them on to me, and still does.
Yeah.
And so I think I got that from her mostly.
What was her reaction when you handed her a copy of your book?
She, she was surprised. I mean, I think she was surprised that I switched to novel writing. I think she thought I would continue writing nonfiction books. And I'm going back to nonfiction for my third book, but I think she was surprised. And she said she read it in two sittings, and I take that as a compliment. So I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, definitely. What made you go from nonfiction to fiction, and which is more time consuming? Because it feels like with fiction you can create whatever you want, but
Yeah.
with nonfiction you have to be sure you get it right because you don't want someone to point out what you got wrong. So which do you enjoy more, and which is more time consuming?
I tell you, I mean, as compared to my first book, I only have the two book comparisons, but I enjoyed writing the novel more than I enjoyed the memoir. I liked the memoir and I needed to write it, and I'm glad I did. But I really enjoyed the creativity part of the novel writing. The When I wrote my memoir, there was certainly you dig deep into your own soul, and that was an interesting experience doing the full brain biopsy. But I think at the same time, you were constrained by having to tell the truth as it happened and trying to pick out which stories to tell and which ones not to. Whereas the novel, I felt like I had latitude to go here and there, wherever the story took me. And I really enjoyed that part of it. I hope one day to write another novel, but we'll see.
What you said the memoir was quite the experience. I would imagine that you go back and revisit times in your life that you maybe not have thought about for a long time that you come to find out were quite transformative for your own life. What was that experience like for you to do that?
I think it was interesting because I think it's, writing a memoir is kind of problem solving in a way. You have to make a lot of decisions. It's not autobiography where you start
Mm.
out from when you're born and go all the way through. You pick out the things that were most impactful. And I left, as many stories on the cutting room table, as it were, as that ended up in the book Exhale. And I think it's interesting, the decisions you have to make about what to include and what not to include.
What is that like when you go through and you write a memoir and you put it out there for anyone to read, and then you meet someone who's read it? What is that like to meet someone, a stranger who has read your book and knows all these things about you?
Yeah, I mean, I remember when the day in May of 2021 when Exhale, my memoir came out, I was terrified, absolutely terrified. And it's interesting, I do meet people that have read the book that, they feel like they know you.
Yeah.
And, I guess they know something about you, but, again, the author chooses to put in the memoir and into any memoir what they want people to know or not to know.
Mhm.
And I think they certainly know a part of you. Whether or not they know you all the way is another matter. But I do find it interesting though, because perfect strangers come up to me and talk to me about this or that, in my life, and they talk like we've known each other for years, which is interesting.
Yeah. I wonder, when you mention other people in a memoir, do you need permission from them, or how does that work? Or do you change their names and?
Yeah, the nature of what I was writing about, I changed, of course, all the patient names and their patient stories in my book, and I changed all of them
Hmm,
to protect their privacy.
right.
I also changed nearly all, not quite all, but nearly all of the people that I worked with. I changed not only their names, but their physical characteristics. I certainly didn't want anybody to feel uncomfortable that I was writing about them. And I think, folks might be hard pressed to know who was who in my memoir unless you really worked closely with me.
Yeah, that must be kind of tough too to get enough wrong, but still have it match your experience and still tell the same story, but not divulge too much.
Yeah, no, I think that's a trick, and I erred on the side of being cautious because you really shouldn't sit down to write a book to try to hurt somebody. It's
Oh
not
yeah.
not a good idea.
No, no, not at all. When what kind of feelings do you want the reader to have when they read your latest book? What do you want what do you want them to feel or experience with the story?
I think it goes, well beyond just experiencing what it's like to be a transplant surgeon.
Mhm.
I think it's more what it's like in any walk of life when you have these very heavy expectations on you. The book, in a lot of ways, is about expectations. We
Mm,
all have certain expectations about life. Some of those are put on us by other people, and some of those are put on us by ourselves. And so I open the book with my main character sort of ruminating really about what's been expected of him,
mm,
and has he fulfilled those expectations. And I think that it was while I was writing the book, it was what was on my mind the most was, how do we handle other people's expectations of us? Do we ignore them? Do we, faithfully follow them? How do we deal with that? And I want readers to not be so focused on, well, he's a transplant surgeon and I'm not, so this has nothing to do with me, but more like I think it has to do with all of us, here on planet Earth, because we do walk around, wondering what other people expect of us, and I think that
mm.
that's really important. I've always thought that the people with the highest expectations in life are some of the unhappiest people you'll meet. Those that have lower expectations often, are happiest, at least in my experience.
Yeah, I think back to was it Calvin and Hobbes? There's one of the panels in the old comic strip that my life is easier the low I keep everyone's expectations or something to that effect. Yeah,
I think that's right. I think that's
yeah, it's a pretty good one. How did you deal with stress and pressure situations in that line of work?
I did a lot of exercising. I mean, for me, that was always the go-to for stress reduction. I also had a lot of friends. I mean, I would ride bikes in California with a group of friends, and that was huge therapy for me. I, also, have a great family myself. I have two daughters who are very supportive, and a wife who's a nurse who's also very
Hmm.
supportive. And I think all of that was really important to me. But the most important things is stay connected to the people you work with. And sometimes I did that really well, and sometimes I didn't do it very well.
Hmm.
But I think that that's hugely important, especially in today's healthcare environment. It's a tough place out there.
How much has that environment changed from when you were when you started to now? How different is it?
A lot, and I'm afraid I'd have to say that it's not changed for the better.
Hmm.
I think the healthcare environment right now is very challenging for the people that work there, and not just because of COVID or anything like that. It's been going on for years. It's just it's a profit driven business that demands a lot out of the people that work in it. And most people that go into medicine, all they want to do is take care of patients, take care of sick people. But we're all spending less and less time doing that because of the business nature of medicine, and I think
Hmm.
that's really negatively impacting it.
That's depressing to hear.
I'm afraid sometimes I've written a number of op-eds, and they're a bit of a downer. I'm afraid at times.
Yeah. No, I can relate but I can relate to the riding your bike. It's my therapy too, so I can
Okay,
definitely relate
okay,
to you there. Yeah.
fellow bike rider, good
Oh
thing.
yeah, definitely. Yeah, as often as I can. It's hard this time of year because it's so hot, but
I know,
yeah,
I know.
yeah, it
Yeah,
gets miserable.
that's true.
But I did have a couple more questions for you before I let you go. The first one being, what is something that your readers would be surprised to learn about you?
Well, I think one thing that's surprising in the book about me is that I wrote a love story in many ways. I think I was sort of a testosterone, ego driven transplant doctor, and I wrote a lot about a love relationship really in this story. So I've already heard, even though the book's only been out a week, I've already heard from a number of people about the love story part of it. So I think that's surprising people.
Were you nervous about that part of the story?
No, I really
Mm.
wasn't because I think it's big. I think that you know just to talk about the work we all do and the pressures that we all have is fine, but I think you really have to show how it impacts the people around us. That's the thing that interests me the most. I saw this in my own work. I mean, it wasn't just me doing it; it was my wife,
Mm.
being impacted by it, my kids being impacted, my friends being impacted by it. And so I wanted to show that in the novel that it's not just one person in the job; it's a whole family and friends situation.
Mm. Yep, makes sense. The second question I have for you is: was there ever a hobby or thing that you wanted to try, but when you tried it, you didn't enjoy it?
Golf.
Golf.
Yeah, yeah, that's an easy one. A lot of my colleagues, it's cliche, but a lot of doctors like to play golf, and I never really picked it up. And when I tried, I couldn't see it. I just didn't understand why it was a thing. I know a lot of people love it out there. The golf courses themselves are beautiful in California, especially where I
Wow.
went. They were gorgeous, but it's something I couldn't pick up.
Yeah, I have a lot of work colleagues that go golfing like every Thursday, and I just don't get it.
Yeah, yeah. What did Mark Twain say? It's a good walk spoiled, or something like that.
Yeah, that's what that. I just don't get it. Like
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe one day it'll make more sense. But my last question for you is: what was your first job, and what did you learn from that experience?
My very first job was a paper route. So I'm old enough where we actually rode a bike with a huge basket. I remember it well because I had 110 papers in the basket, and I would get up at 4 in the morning and ride through the streets of New Orleans throwing these papers, and I would have to throw all 110 of them. So I got to be a pretty good bike rider and could handle a bike with a big basket in the front, and I ended up being able to throw them pretty well. So that was my first job. I think I was 12 or 13 at the time.
What was your takeaway? Was there anything that you learned from that experience that you've carried with you through your
I
life?
got really good at waking up early, which is a nice thing for a doctor to know how to do because we wake up really early. And then also just the discipline of knowing that, no matter rain or shine, you got to go out and throw the paper. And, I lived in a tropical climate and I rode my bike through a lot of thunderstorms. I can tell you that. So it really was a good learning experience. I liked it.
Need that newspaper. It needs to be, has to be delivered.
Sorry, I missed that.
It just, we, that if that newspaper wasn't delivered, you'd probably hear about it.
Oh yeah, I mean it was the days before the internet, of course, and so people were counting on it for their news.
Yeah. Times are, I miss that. I miss the
Yeah,
newspaper. Yeah.
me too. Me too.
Yeah. But David, thank you for coming by. I know you're very busy, so I appreciate you taking the time to come and chat with me for a few minutes.
Thank you, Steve. I enjoyed the conversation. I appreciate
Yeah.
it.
If you ever like to come back, just let me know and we'll figure something out.
Perfect. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much.